When the gunman raised his weapon in the middle of the Harrington Continental lobby, every single person dropped to the floor, except for one. Elias Rourke, a single father wearing a faded maintenance uniform, stood completely still. He did not run, did not flinch, and did not raise his hands in surrender. Instead, he spoke in a calm, steady voice, so calm that the armed man slowly began listening to every word he said. From the glass observation floor above, the chief executive officer, Celeste Harrington, watched the entire scene unfold in silence. She had seen senior executives panic over a single bad quarterly report, yet the man her own security director had mocked only hours earlier was now the only thing standing between chaos and disaster. When police finally secured the building and Celeste asked Elias what reward he wanted for saving dozens of lives, his answer left the entire room speechless, and it would soon unravel a conspiracy far larger than anyone in that lobby could have imagined. Before you hear what happened next, press subscribe now, because Elias is about to expose the real traitor inside Harrington Continental, and his next move will change everyone's fate. Hours before the gunman ever entered the building, Elias arrived at the Harrington Continental Tower, while the morning sky was still gray, carrying a tablet and a tool bag down to the trading floor to check the fire suppression system. While running diagnostics, he discovered that several security sensors near the eastern corridor had been manually disabled sometime during the night, a detail that struck him as far too deliberate to be a simple malfunction. He reported it immediately to Preston Vane, the director of security, but Preston brushed him off without even looking up from his phone. More concerned with the board members arriving within the hour than with a warning from a man in coveralls. The lobby was already filling with early arrivals, executives in tailored suits sipping coffee from the private cafe reserved for senior staff, none of them aware that something in the building's defenses had quietly gone wrong overnight. In front of two senior executives waiting for the private elevator, Preston ordered Elias to use the freight elevator instead, claiming that his uniform would damage the polished image of the main lobby. Elias calmly reminded him that disabled sensors were not a cosmetic issue, but Preston laughed it off, telling him that a man hired to change light bulbs had no business pretending to understand security architecture. 30 floors above, Celeste was preparing to announce a $4 billion merger, while Harlan Blackwood, the chief financial officer and vice chairman of the board, pressed her to sign the final documents before the market closed for the day. She glanced down briefly and noticed Elias being turned away from the elevator bank, but to her it looked like nothing more than a minor disagreement between departments. The kind of friction that happened 100 times a day in a building this size. Elias returned to the control room and noticed something stranger still. The camera feed covering the east entrance was looping the exact same 90 seconds of footage over and over again. Before he could escalate the report a second time, Mason Reddick walked into the main lobby, pulled a handgun from beneath his coat, and ordered everyone to get down on the floor. The security doors locked automatically, sealing Celeste and the board members on the glass floor above, close enough to see everything happening below but powerless to leave or intervene directly. Preston immediately ordered his security team to move toward Mason, even though the positioning of hostages made any sudden approach extremely dangerous for everyone in the room. Elias noticed that Mason's eyes were not fixed on the teller counters where the cash was kept, but instead kept drifting toward the hallway leading to the records vault. Before Elias could fully process what that meant, Mason looked directly at him and called him by name, a name the two men had never exchanged before that morning. The silence that followed Mason's first command stretched on for what felt like several minutes, though only seconds had actually passed. Employees curled beneath their desks held their breath, certain they were about to witness something none of them would ever forget. A young teller near the counter began crying quietly, and an older man beside her reached out instinctively to cover her hand with his own, neither of them daring to lift their head. Mason ordered Elias to step forward into the open space of the lobby, and several terrified employees assumed he had just become the gunman's next target. Through a hidden earpiece, Preston instructed Elias to dive sideways so the security team could get a clear angle, but Elias understood immediately that any sudden movement could send Mason into a panic and get someone shot. He calmly removed the earpiece, set it on the floor in front of him, and chose not to follow the order at all. Keeping both hands clearly visible, he spoke slowly to Mason, refusing to call him a criminal, refusing to threaten him, and refusing to pretend everything was fine. Mason demanded access to Records Vault number 314, and Elias explained honestly that he did not have clearance for that vault, but that he could find someone who did, if Mason agreed to release the older hostages first. Mason hesitated, then agreed to let 5 people go. From the glass floor, Celeste watched as a maintenance worker that Preston had dismissed only hours earlier accomplished something the entire security division had failed to manage. Harlan insisted the moment was simply luck and pushed Celeste to let Preston's team take direct action, but she refused, unwilling to risk the lives still trapped below. As the standoff continued, Elias noticed that Mason's hand trembled every time someone mentioned money, a detail that told him this was not a robbery driven by greed. Mason admitted he had once worked inside Harrington Continental as a compliance supervisor before being accused of embezzling more than $2 million. Elias did not promise to believe him outright, only that if Mason wanted the truth to come out, he had to guarantee that nobody in that lobby got hurt. Slowly, Mason began lowering the weapon, until Preston triggered a secondary alarm meant to disorient him, a sound so sudden that Mason jerked the gun back up in fear. Elias stepped between Mason and the nearest group of hostages without attacking, calmly instructing everyone to stay exactly where they were. He noticed the engraving on a chain around Mason's neck and quietly spoke the name of his estranged wife, a small detail that made Mason pause and finally start to listen rather than react. Before the conversation could continue, Mason muttered something that froze the room, telling Elias that the person who truly stole from the company was standing on the glass floor watching them right now. Elias did not glance upward, knowing that even a small reaction could shatter the fragile trust he had built. Instead, he asked Mason directly what he had hoped to find inside Vault 314. Mason explained that the vault held archived compliance records, copies of transactions he had discovered shortly before he was fired for supposedly stealing money he insisted he never touched. Up on the glass floor, Harlan immediately told Celeste that Mason was clearly fabricating a story out of bitterness, urging her to cut the power to the lobby and let the tactical team handle the rest. Celeste began to grow suspicious, since Harlan seemed to know far too much detail about what Mason was searching for, despite the audio feed only carrying fragments of the conversation below. Elias convinced Mason to release several more hostages in exchange for allowing Naomi Caldwell, the bank's general counsel, to come down and verify the vault records herself. Naomi agreed without hesitation, but Preston objected loudly, insisting that a senior attorney should never take instructions from, in his words, a failed employee, and a janitor. For the first time, Celeste directly overruled Preston in front of the entire board, ordering him to let Elias continue. Naomi descended to the lobby with her access card, only to discover that clearance for Vault 314 had been mysteriously revoked just 10 minutes before the robbery began. Mason accused Elias of lying to him, and the tension in the room snapped back into place instantly. Elias did not defend himself or argue. Instead, he asked Mason a simple question. How could he have known the vault still held records if he had been terminated 8 months earlier? Mason explained that someone inside the bank had anonymously warned him the files were scheduled for destruction by the end of that very day. Elias realized in that instant that Mason might have been deliberately lured into the building to manufacture exactly the kind of scandal someone else needed. Before Mason could reveal who had sent the warning, every light in the lobby went dark at once. In the sudden blackness, Preston ordered his security team to charge forward, ignoring the fact that hostages were scattered throughout the room. Elias kept his voice low and steady, holding Mason in place and telling everyone present not to run or make a sound. And remarkably, not a single shot was fired in the darkness. When emergency power finally restored the lights, everyone saw Elias standing only a few feet from Mason, the handgun already resting on the floor between them. Mason raised both hands in surrender without a word of resistance. The man once forbidden from using the main elevator had just become the only reason an entire lobby of strangers walked out alive that morning. As officers led him away in handcuffs, Mason leaned close to Elias and whispered one final instruction, telling him to find out exactly who had disabled the cameras before he ever stepped through the front doors. Once police secured the scene, news vans began crowding the street outside Harrington Continental. Within minutes, satellite dishes rising above the crowd as anchors rehearsed their opening lines on the sidewalk. Preston tried to organize an impromptu press conference, claiming his security division had skillfully coordinated Mason's surrender, and he ordered Elias to step away from the area reserved for senior leadership, as though the last hour had never happened at all. Detective Avery Shaw arrived on scene and immediately recognized Elias, quietly informing Celeste that the man in coveralls had once been one of the finest crisis negotiators the county had ever employed, a revelation that visibly shifted something behind her eyes. Preston's tone shifted instantly, suddenly calling Elias the hero of Harrington and inviting him to stand beside leadership in front of the cameras, an offer Elias flatly refused. Inside a private conference room, Celeste thanked him personally and offered a reward of $1 million, believing it was the appropriate way to honor a man who had just saved dozens of lives. The room itself felt strange to him, all soft, leather chairs and floor-to-ceiling glass, a world away from the boiler rooms and crawl spaces where he usually spent his days. Elias looked at the check but never reached for it. He told her plainly that Mason had committed a real crime and would have to answer for it, but that did not mean everything Mason had said was a lie, a distinction he suspected most people in this building had never bothered to consider. When Celeste asked what he wanted instead of money, he gave her 3 conditions: that no records inside Vault 314 be destroyed, that an independent firm be hired to audit the employee pension fund, and that his own image never be used to distract from the real cause of what had happened that morning. The room fell completely silent. Harlan mocked him openly, suggesting that an hourly employee had no business lecturing a board of directors on how to run a financial institution. Elias replied calmly that if the board had truly been running things properly, A desperate man would never have walked through a security system that had been deliberately switched off. Celeste realized in that moment that Elias was not using this opportunity to change his own life. He was using it to protect employees who did not even know his name. She agreed immediately to freeze the vault and authorize Naomi to open a formal investigation. Harlan warned that such a move could collapse the entire merger negotiations within days. Celeste answered that no business deal mattered more than the truth behind thousands of pension accounts belonging to the people who built this company. That same evening, Naomi discovered something deeply troubling buried in the security logs. The command that disabled the lobby cameras had originated from Elias Rourke's personal account. Within hours, the narrative around Elias began to shift in a way that felt almost engineered, each new headline crueler and more confident than the last. By morning, an anonymous source had leaked system logs to the press appearing to show his credentials disabling the cameras and unlocking a side entrance shortly before the robbery began. The story flipped instantly, with headlines now suggesting that Elias and Mason had staged the entire event together to collect a reward. Commentators on television speculating freely about motives neither of them had ever actually expressed. Preston suspended him in front of the entire staff, confiscating his access badge and telling him that a man like him should never have believed a moment of luck could earn him a place among people like the Harringtons. Several executives who had praised him only the day before now avoided eye contact in the hallways. Celeste wanted to believe him, but Naomi warned that the technical evidence currently pointed directly at Elias. He did not beg or plead his case. He simply asked to see the exact timestamps when those commands had been issued. The logs showed his account logging in at a moment when he was actually repairing pipework 2 floors below. Footage that Preston dismissed by claiming the commands could have been scheduled in advance. Elias remembered that 3 weeks earlier, Preston had ordered every maintenance employee to surrender their access cards temporarily for what he called a security upgrade. He suspected his login credentials had been copied during that very process. That night, Quinn, his 17-year-old daughter, asked why the news kept calling her father a fraud after everyone had just watched him save dozens of lives. Elias tried to comfort her by saying he would simply find another job somewhere quieter. Quinn asked if he intended to keep walking away every time someone powerful decided to rewrite what actually happened. The question struck him deeply, reminding him of the exact reason he had left police work in the first place. He realized that staying silent to protect his daughter might actually be teaching her that dignity only belonged to people who could afford expensive lawyers. That night he sat alone in his kitchen long after Quinn had gone to bed, turning over the same memory that had haunted him for years, the image of a young rookie freezing during a standoff that ended in tragedy, and the moment his supervisor had pushed a falsified report across the table and asked him simply to sign his name beneath a version of events that never happened. He had refused then, and watched his career quietly dissolve over the following months. Transfers to worthless assignments, evaluations that mysteriously turned negative, opportunities that vanished without explanation, until resigning felt less like defeat and more like the only honest option left. He decided, once and for all, that he would not run from this fight the way he had once been forced to walk away from that one. Meanwhile, Celeste reviewed the building's footage from before the robbery began and noticed Preston lingering near the control room despite his official report claiming he had been on the 30th floor the entire time. Unable to ignore the contradiction, she drove to Elias's modest house that evening without informing her security detail or legal team, something she had never once done in 15 years of running a company surrounded by advisors. The simple neighborhood stood in sharp contrast to the glass towers she usually occupied, rows of small homes with porch lights glowing and children's bicycles left on front lawns, a world she had only ever glimpsed from the back seat of a chauffeured car. Elias did not greet her with gratitude or nervous excitement. He simply asked whether she had come as the chief executive or as someone genuinely searching for the truth, a question that caught her off guard because no one had ever spoken to her quite so directly. She admitted she no longer knew exactly who on her own board she could trust, a confession that seemed to cost her something to say out loud. She showed him the footage of Preston near the control room, though it alone was not enough to prove he had stolen Elias's login credentials, and for nearly an hour the two of them sat at his kitchen table, sorting through timestamps and access logs like two detectives rather than a billionaire and a maintenance worker. She offered to reinstate his position and provide legal representation if he agreed to sign a confidentiality agreement, an offer he declined without hesitation, watching her expression carefully to see whether she understood why. He told her that a polite non-disclosure form was simply a softer version of the same silence that had pushed him out of law enforcement years earlier, dressed up in better paper and a larger signing bonus, but silence all the same. Quinn appeared briefly to greet Celeste before retreating to give the two adults privacy, offering only a quiet nod before disappearing down the hallway. Elias finally explained the story behind his old career, describing a crisis years earlier when a superior had ordered a rushed intervention that resulted in the death of an innocent bystander, a memory he had carried in silence for nearly a decade without ever fully speaking it aloud to anyone outside his own family. He had refused to sign a report claiming that decision had been necessary, and afterward he was labeled difficult, passed over for promotion, and eventually pushed out of the department while caring for his dying wife, two losses that arrived almost simultaneously and left him with little energy to fight either one. Celeste understood then why Elias was not afraid of losing this job, since he had already sacrificed an entire career to protect the truth once before, and somehow walked away from it without losing the part of himself that still believed it had been worth it. She confessed that she often signed off on major decisions based entirely on reports prepared by Harlan and Preston without verifying them herself. Elias did not accuse her of corruption, but he pointed out that ignorance at the top still produced very real consequences for people at the bottom. The comment clearly stung, yet she did not argue against it. Instead, the two agreed to work together outside official channels, with Celeste using her authority to protect the vault, Naomi auditing the suspicious transactions, Elias analyzing exactly how the security system had been manipulated, and all three agreeing that nothing they uncovered would erase Mason's responsibility for bringing a weapon into that lobby. A quiet respect began forming between Elias and Celeste throughout these late conversations. She noticed he never tried to charm or manipulate her. In fact, he frequently challenged her assumptions outright. Before leaving that night, she asked why he was still willing to help a company that had treated him so poorly. He answered simply that thousands of ordinary employees should not lose their retirement savings just because the people at the very top never bothered to look down. Days later, Naomi uncovered 17 separate consulting firms quietly draining funds from the employee pension account, every single one of them eventually tracing back to a private investment vehicle controlled by the Blackwood family. Celeste called an emergency closed-door meeting with Harlan, Preston, and Naomi present. The four of them gathered around the same polished table where countless ordinary decisions had once been made without anyone questioning them. Harlan denied any connection to the consulting firms, claiming his family invested in thousands of businesses and could not possibly track every transaction personally, his tone calm and rehearsed as though he had anticipated this exact accusation for years. Naomi laid out evidence showing pension funds moving through several layers of shell companies before eventually landing inside Blackwood Strategic Holdings, sliding printed pages across the table one by one until even the most skeptical board member could no longer look away. Harlan countered by revealing that Celeste had been secretly meeting with Elias, accusing her of letting personal feelings cloud her professional judgment. Several board members immediately grew suspicious of the relationship between the chief executive and the very employee suspected of complicity days earlier, whispers traveling through the executive floor faster than any of the actual evidence ever could. Harlan called for an emergency vote to suspend Celeste, framing her behavior as a serious legal liability for the entire company, his voice carrying the practiced confidence of a man who had won this kind of argument many times before. Naomi insisted Elias be brought in to explain the security systems in detail, but Preston physically blocked him at the conference room door, telling him this room was reserved for shareholders, not pipefitters. Celeste rose from her seat without a word, walked past Preston, opened the door herself, and ordered a chair placed beside her own at the head of the table. Inside the meeting, Harlan asked Elias mockingly how much money Celeste had promised him to fabricate this entire story, his tone dripping with the same contempt he had used on every employee he considered beneath his notice for 30 years. Elias did not raise his voice, nor did he flinch under the weight of every eye in the room turning toward him. He displayed 3 separate timestamps on the conference screen, showing that his login credentials had been duplicated 3 weeks before the robbery, that the lobby cameras had gone dark 18 minutes before Mason ever entered the building, and that Mason's old security badge had been remotely reactivated from inside the security office despite his termination 8 months earlier. Preston insisted this was simply a system error, but Elias asked why that same error had conveniently opened the exact path leading Mason straight to Vault 314. The room fell silent. Harlan claimed Mason and Elias must have coordinated everything together beforehand, prompting Elias to request that the full hostage negotiation recording be replayed. In the recording, Mason mispronounced Elias's name twice and clearly had no idea about his negotiation background, proving the two men had never actually known each other before that morning. Despite the mounting evidence, Harlan still held enough votes to force a decision, presenting Celeste with an ultimatum: either fire Elias and end the investigation immediately, or the board would strip her of her position as chief executive. Celeste hesitated. Elias stood and told her she should not sacrifice the entire bank just to protect one employee's reputation. Harlan smiled, believing he had just secured an easy victory. Elias continued speaking, telling her she did not need to protect him at all. Only the evidence itself needed protection. Further investigation revealed that Harlan's ambitions extended far beyond the pension fund alone. For nearly 2 years, he had been quietly steering Harrington Continental toward a disastrous acquisition, pushing the bank to purchase a struggling regional lender at a price well above its actual value, while concealing the fact that the failing institution was itself controlled, several layers removed, by a private fund bearing the Blackwood family name. Every dollar drained from the pension accounts had been funneled through consulting fees, advisory retainers, and shell partnerships designed to look ordinary on paper while quietly enriching the very man overseeing the books. Naomi calculated that the scheme, left unchecked for even another fiscal quarter, would have cost employees and shareholders alike hundreds of millions of dollars before anyone outside the boardroom ever noticed. The robbery, it turned out, had been engineered to accomplish three separate goals at once: destroy the records in Vault 314 under the cover of crisis cleanup, crash the company's stock price through public panic, and prove that Celeste was unfit to lead, creating the perfect justification to replace her entirely. Preston had personally sent Mason the false warning about destroyed records and reactivated his old badge, giving him just enough access to believe he could slip inside undetected. Harlan never directly ordered Mason to bring a weapon, but he understood perfectly well that a desperate, wronged man might create exactly the kind of crisis his plan required. Celeste was horrified to realize Harlan had been willing to endanger employees and customers alike just to seize control of the company. He fought back through the media, leaking photographs of Celeste arriving at Elias' house and accusing the chief executive of an inappropriate relationship with a key witness, a claim that spread across financial news channels within hours and overshadowed every legitimate question about the missing pension funds. Reporters swarmed Elias outside his own front door, microphones thrust towards face each morning, focusing entirely on the narrative of a poor single father being favored by a billionaire executive rather than examining any of the financial evidence Naomi had spent weeks assembling. Neighbors who had known him for years suddenly looked at him differently, some offering awkward sympathy, others crossing the street to avoid the cameras camped outside his home. Quinn faced uncomfortable questions from classmates about the rumors swirling around her father, whispered conversations that stopped abruptly whenever she walked into a room. Elias considered withdrawing from the investigation entirely just to shield her from further attention. Quinn told him she did not need protection from lies if the cost of that protection was letting those lies become accepted as truth. Elias agreed to appear at the upcoming shareholder hearing on one condition: that Celeste never use his story as a single father to manipulate public sympathy, a condition she accepted without question. Around this time, Mason revealed through his attorney that he still possessed a copy of his original compliance report, locked inside a personal storage box whose access had been frozen after his arrest. Naomi immediately filed for a legal order to preserve the document before it could disappear. Preston, realizing the danger this posed, attempted to erase any digital trail connecting himself to that storage account. Elias predicted that Preston, too prideful to simply vanish, would instead try to attend the upcoming hearing in an attempt to control the narrative himself. Before that hearing could even begin, Harlan publicly announced he had secured enough votes to remove Celeste from her position and finalize the fraudulent acquisition that very same day. The shareholder hearing was held in the very lobby where the robbery had taken place weeks earlier, the same marble floor, the same tall windows, though now lined with rows of folding chairs and a raised platform for the board to address the crowd, reporters, employees, and investors packed the room as Harlan prepared to use the moment to permanently end Celeste's leadership. His confidence evident in the easy way he moved through the crowd, shaking hands before the proceedings even began. He painted her as an emotional heir who had endangered the entire bank by trusting the word of a maintenance worker over trained professionals. Elias walked in through the front entrance, and this time no security guard dared to stop him. Harlan mocked his plain suit, asking sarcastically whether Celeste had personally purchased it for him. Elias replied that a former mentor once taught him that a uniform never determined the value of the words spoken inside it. Detective Avery Shaw confirmed Elias's background and the true reason behind his departure from law enforcement, though Elias refused to lean on his old reputation to win the argument outright. He requested that the full security timeline be displayed on screen for everyone present. Each question he asked caused Preston to contradict his own previous statements, claiming he had no knowledge of the disabled cameras while having quietly redirected his security team away from that exact blind spot, insisting Mason's badge reactivation was accidental, despite having personally deleted the access logs before investigators could request them, and accusing Elias of orchestrating the robbery without ever explaining how his account could have issued commands while he was clearly visible on basement footage at that exact moment. With each contradiction, murmurs spread through the rows of shareholders, and several board members who had stayed silent until now began exchanging uneasy glances, recalculating who exactly deserved their trust. Preston grew visibly rattled, his composed executive demeanor cracking piece by piece, eventually turning on Harlan in a desperate attempt to shift blame elsewhere. Harlan insisted that the word of a lower-level employee carried no real weight in a room full of shareholders. Naomi entered with the original report recovered from Mason's storage box, a document bearing Harlan's own signature, confirming he had been warned about the pension shortfall 8 months before the robbery ever occurred. Harlan attempted to leave the room, but Celeste ordered independent security to immediately suspend his access privileges. Shareholders began withdrawing their support for the merger one by one as the full scope of the deception became clear. Harlan turned to Elias one last time, suggesting he could still become a wealthy man if he simply learned to choose the right side. Elias replied that Harlan had misunderstood him from the very beginning, that his calm during the robbery had never come from a lack of fear, but from years of experience watching powerful people weaponize fear to keep everyone else quiet. Then, in front of the entire room, Celeste turned to Elias and asked what amount of money he believed the bank should pay him. The crowd waited to hear a number, and somewhere in the back of the room a reporter had already raised a phone to record the moment, certain it would make tomorrow's headline. Harlan, still being detained nearby, smirked, certain that Elias would finally reveal his true motivation had been money all along, just like everyone who had ever stood in that lobby chasing power. Elias approached the microphone slowly, taking a moment to look out over the rows of faces, employees and executives seated side by side for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, and made no request for stock, no demand for a title, and no personal compensation whatsoever. Instead, he laid out a different kind of payment entirely, one that would not appear on any individual bank statement, but would be felt by nearly every person who had ever worked beneath that roof. He asked that every dollar stolen from the pension fund be repaid in full along with the lost interest, that a legal defense fund be established for employees who reported wrongdoing in the future, that counseling be provided for every hostage affected by the trauma of that morning, that a public apology be issued to Mason for the false embezzlement accusation, even though Mason would still answer fully for threatening innocent people with a weapon, and that the company eliminate every separate elevator, dining room, and hallway that divided executives from the people who kept the building running. Several executives bristled at that final demand, but Elias explained that a culture treating certain employees as invisible was exactly what had allowed this entire scheme to thrive undetected. Celeste approved every single request without hesitation, even canceling executive bonuses for the year to help fund the new employee program. The room rose in applause, not simply because Elias had saved them weeks earlier, but because he had just refused an opportunity to elevate himself above everyone else in that building, a refusal that struck many of them as more remarkable than the negotiation itself. Several employees who had spent years quietly enduring the same dismissive treatment Elias once received found themselves wiping away tears, recognizing in his words something they had never expected to hear spoken aloud inside that lobby. Harlan was escorted out through the very service entrance Elias had once been forced to use himself, a detail not lost on anyone watching, the irony so sharp that a few reporters mentioned it explicitly in their coverage that evening. Preston was arrested for falsifying records, obstructing the investigation, and participating in the broader financial conspiracy, his career and reputation collapsing within the same week he had once tried to use to silence the very man who exposed him. Celeste retained her position as chief executive, but publicly accepted responsibility for failing to question the people she had allowed to operate in her name for far too long. Afterward, she asked Elias whether he would be willing to return to work at Harrington Continental. He told her he would not accept his old role simply to be praised as a hero for a few weeks before everyone returned to treating other employees the same way as before. She offered him the freedom to design any position he believed the company genuinely needed. Elias declined the title of security director outright, unwilling to simply become a more polished version of Preston Vane. Instead, he proposed creating an Office of Safety and Integrity, an independent department reporting directly to the Audit Committee rather than to the chief executive herself, a structure deliberately designed so that no single person, however well-intentioned, could ever again bury an inconvenient truth simply by giving an order. Its responsibilities would include managing crisis response, protecting whistleblowers, reviewing leadership decisions for hidden risk, and ensuring that ordinary employees were heard long before small problems became full-blown disasters. Several board members questioned why such authority should exist outside their direct control, but after everything that had happened, none of them found the courage to vote against it. Elias agreed to lead the new department, on the condition that his working hours still allowed him to remain present in his daughter's life, refusing to trade one form of absence for another, simply because the paycheck had grown larger. Celeste accepted without negotiation. Mason ultimately pleaded guilty to unlawful detainment and making criminal threats, and because he had surrendered voluntarily, cooperated fully with investigators, and harmed no one physically, the court considered a fair sentence rather than the harshest possible punishment, though his actions were never excused. Elias attended the sentencing, not to speak in Mason's defense, but simply to be present, a quiet acknowledgement that a man could be both guilty and wronged at the same time. The embezzlement charge against him was formally dropped once evidence confirmed. Harlan had falsely accused him to cover his own theft, and the bank issued a written apology that Naomi insisted be made public rather than buried in a private settlement. The pension fund was fully restored using assets seized from Harlan and the companies tied to his scheme, with employees receiving letters explaining exactly what had happened and exactly how it had been fixed, a transparency that would have been unthinkable under the old leadership. Quinn visited her father's new office one afternoon and noticed his old maintenance uniform still hanging carefully inside the closet rather than thrown away. Elias told her he felt no shame about that uniform at all, explaining that the only shameful thing had ever been the people who assumed it meant he wasn't worth listening to. He and Celeste continued working closely together in the months that followed, though she never used her position to rush whatever was growing quietly between them. Elias slowly realized that her commitment to change went beyond simple public image, since she personally attended meetings with frontline employees, listening to honest criticism even when no cameras were present to record it. A quiet, unspoken connection began forming between them, one neither of them rushed to define just yet. A quiet, unspoken connection began forming between them, one neither of them rushed to define just yet, built not on grand gestures but on the slow accumulation of small, honest moments, a shared lunch here, a late phone call there, the kind of trust that could not be manufactured by any amount of money or title. 1 year later, Harrington Continental held its very first company-wide crisis drill, designed entirely by employees from the lower floors of the building, rather than imposed from above. There was no longer a separate entrance reserved for anyone wearing a maintenance uniform. Everyone now walked through the very same lobby together each morning, executives and custodians alike pressing the same elevator buttons, waiting in the same lines, greeted by the same security guards who had once been instructed to look the other way. The Office of Safety and Integrity that Elias built from nothing now employed 11 people, several of them former hostages from that very morning, who had asked to be part of making sure nothing like it ever happened again. After the drill concluded, Celeste found Elias at the small coffee shop directly across the street from headquarters and asked whether he still believed powerful people were incapable of looking down to notice the people beneath them. He told her she had made real progress, though there was still plenty of practice left ahead of her. She smiled and asked if he would be willing to have dinner with her that Friday evening, making it clear the invitation had nothing to do with company business, nothing to do with titles or boardrooms or anything either of them had to prove to the other anymore. Elias glanced toward Quinn, who waited just outside the shop pretending to be absorbed in her phone, though she offered her father a small, knowing nod. He accepted the invitation without hesitation. Before Celeste left the coffee shop, she asked him one final question: what exactly had allowed him to stay so calm on the day the robbery began? Elias looked back toward the lobby that had once been filled with fear and answered her with the same quiet conviction that had once stopped a desperate man from pulling the trigger. Calm, he told her, never meant the absence of fear at all. It simply meant a person had already decided, long before the danger ever arrived, exactly who deserved to be protected first. And that decision, once made honestly, rarely needed to be made twice.